The epithelial tissues are composed of sheets of cells. These sheets may consist of a single layer, or the epithelial tissue may contain multiple layers of cells. Generally, epithelial tissues cover body surfaces, that is, both external surfaces and internal surfaces. They also line cavities and compose most of the body's glands. They function to protect against physical damage, chemical damage, and against attack from biological organisms. Some epithelia secrete mucus or form a membrane that secretes fluid, which is called serous fluid. And typically serous fluid functions to reduce friction between adjacent organs, particularly during movement. The epithelial tissues are avascular, which means they lack blood vessels, and so they depend on connective tissues underneath them to bring blood vessels in close proximity to nourish them. And epithelial tissues are quite good at regenerating, that is, they produce new cells in deeper layers and push older cells superficially, that is, for epithelial tissues that contain multiple layers. Epithelial cells are connected to adjacent cells with specialized cell junctions. Different junctions serve different purposes, and therefore they are found in very specific places throughout the body. The first example here is tight junctions, and these junctions function as barriers in order to prevent materials from moving between the adjacent cells of an epithelial tissue. And this helps to prevent chemicals or materials from seeping down into deeper layers of tissue and potentially causing damage. Typically, tight junctions are found in epithelial tissues that form the skin, that line the stomach, and the small intestine. Tight junctions consist of small proteins that tightly seal the space between adjacent cells of an epithelial tissue, which is quite useful for preventing things from getting between the cells of that epithelium and affecting deeper layers. So, for instance, the epithelial cells of the stomach have abundant tight junctions in order to prevent stomach acids and stomach enzymes from damaging deeper layers. Gap junctions function as channels between adjacent cells, which allow materials to move from the interior of one cell to the interior of another cell. These are quite common in cardiac muscle tissue because they allow for the spreading of chemical molecules like calcium that will coordinate muscle contraction. Gap junctions provide protein tunnels for materials to move between adjacent cells in a tissue. Although these are not too common in many epithelial tissues, this is a common cell-cell junction that's found in things like cardiac muscle cells. And finally, we have desmosomes, and desmosomes function in stabilizing epithelial sheets. The proteins of desmosomes extend from the plasma membranes of adjacent cells, and those proteins that make up those desmosomes help to link the adjacent cells into a solid sheet, which helps to prevent tearing. This is a common cell-cell junction in the epithelial tissues that make up the skin, and they're also found in cardiac muscle cells as well. Desmosomes use interlocking proteins that are found between adjacent cells in order to tightly anchor nearby cells, epithelial cells, or in the case of cardiac muscle cells, this tightly anchors those cells to one another. These are quite common in areas that resist tearing or that must be resistant to tearing, such as adjacent cardiac muscle cells and the epithelial tissues that make up the skin. Epithelial cells often have specialized extensions of their plasma membrane which aid in carrying out their overall functions. We will review two kinds of membrane extensions here, the cilia and the microvilli. Cilia are hair-like extensions that move rhythmically, and they function to propel materials across the cell surface, such as ova or eggs through the female reproductive tract, mucus through the respiratory passageways, or dust and debris. These are typically found on cells that are lining the uterine tubes and the uterus of the female reproductive system, the female reproductive tract, as well as the airways belonging to the respiratory system. And then we also have microvilli, and microvilli are finger-like extensions that help to increase the surface area of the cell. They're typically referred to as the brush border of the cells because they resemble small bristles on the surface of those cells. They help cells absorb materials more efficiently because of the increased plasma membrane surface area that they provide. And these are typically found on cells lining the small intestine or the kidney tubules, because the function of the cells of the small intestine is to absorb digested nutrients, and the cells that line the kidney tubules absorb water and electrolytes that have been filtered from the bloodstream.